Sumas Shop, TikTok, two.
I was running, I was on the jump of Babylon. Headed to the shore from a den among the trees. Came here to change form, shifting into be. Skin black and white, had a blow to my sleeves. Now I'm swimming, I am racing to a cake deep in the sea. My leggy friends keep the reason here, thankfully. She'll close the gas, shut my bin, so expertly. Sweet elements, my elements, surprise tactically. My sugar's got it coming, won't be expecting me. He'll be fishing, but he will not. Catching a damn thing, cause I will come to see how different his boat and his human tasty. Jerusalem, Londoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Jerusalem, ikhaya lami, Londoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Dawo yami, ayikholana, uso wami, awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Dawo yami, ayikholana, uso wami, awukholana. Ilondoloze, nami. Ilondoloze, 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 zungangishilana. Ilondoloze, ilondoloze, zungangishilana. Dawo yami, ayikholana, uso wami, awukholana. Ilondoloze, dawo yami, ayikholana, uso wami, awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Jerusalem, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Jerusalem, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Oyami, ayikholana, uso wami, awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good bio break, fresh air, coffee, water. I'm just going to welcome our panelists to the stage, to the proverbial virtual stage. Um, Ananda, Rebecca, Jen, I think we're going to put you on the screen. Hello, everybody. Good day. Tansegwakia, Nia Melina Miawapin Labo Masmo, Nia Nihiao, Kinaskumtanawao. It is nice to be here virtually with everybody. We are going to start our panel soon. Is Jen gonna join as well?
Jen is joining just a little bit later, so we'll go second.
Okay, cool. Perfect. I didn't know if I should wait. Okay, so we are going to start this next session here. I think just so Ananda and Rebecca know, we took a break. So I think more people are going to be coming on as we took a look about 20-minute bio break. So from our earlier Just Transition panel. So more people will probably be joining as we get going. But we're also live streaming as well on YouTube. But I wanted to, introduce the panel, introduce the theme, and then introduce the panelists. So the idea of the Red Deal has been developed by those at the Red Nation. They write the proposed Green New Deal (GND) legislation is a step in the right direction to combat climate change and hold corporate polluters responsible. A mass mobilization like ones we've never seen before in history is required to save the planet. Indigenous movements have always been at the forefront of these struggles. Democratic Socialist Congresswoman and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the main proponent of the GND, is herself a water protector who began a successful congressional run while she was at Standing Rock protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. With this background in mind, I'm just going to bring this down. The Red Nation is proposing a Red Deal. It's not the Red New Deal just because it's the same old deal. The fulfillment actually includes treaty rights, land restoration, sovereignty, self-determination, decolonization, and liberation. Ours is the oldest class struggle in the Americas, centuries-long resistance for a world that many worlds fits. Indigenous peoples are suited to lead this important movement, but it must come from the ground up. The Red Deal is not a counter program to the Green New Deal. It's a call for action beyond the scope of the U.S. colonial state and the so-called Canada, where we are located today. It's a program for Indigenous liberation, life, and land, an affirmation from colonialism and capitalism that this capitalism and colonialism must be overturned for the planet to be hospitable for humans and non-human relatives to live dignified lives. Joining us today are three incredible changemakers who will be sharing their work on Indigenous and decolonial climate action. So I'm very happy to introduce Ananda Tan, who is currently a strategy advisor at the Just Transition Alliance, as well as Rebecca, Nihiao Iskew, currently acting as program coordinator for Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective and working as an independent Indigenous researcher working on Indigenous rights and climate justice. And Jen Goby, who will be joining us later, who's a settler climate activist and researcher in Abenaki territory in rural Quebec. So sorry for just trying to read all of that, trying to get it all into a couple beginning points of a theme, but just so happy to be joined by Ananda and Rebecca today, and then Jen later. But Ananda, who I would call an OG, who's somebody who I deeply respect and somebody that's involved in movements upon movements upon movements across Turtle Island and around the world, somebody that I look up to, somebody that is kind, loving, and compassionate. More leaders, I think, that should be this way, and I just love being around Ananda anytime I get to learn from Ananda. So I'm so happy that you could start us off in your presentation today, Ananda. Just wanted to say thank you for joining us today, and super looking forward to hearing from you, Ananda, and then Rebekah after will follow, who I'm super excited to hear about from as well, Rebekah. So excited to listen to more of your research. And Rebekah's been doing work with ICA on decolonizing climate policy with us. So it's been such a great experience to work with you as well, Rebekah. So I'll turn it over to you first, Ananda, and then we'll go to Rebekah. Hi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Melina, and what an honor and pleasure to be here with all of you and in this work and see how the work of Indigenous climate action itself has expanded over the years and really engaged all that needs to be engaged. It's an amazing time. It's a challenging time. It's a time that's full of grief, that's full of joy, that's full of realization. And with that, I'd love to share a few reflections on. And what I thought I would do is probably provide some context, some of the background to a deeper discussion that I'm really looking forward to learning from around the Red Deal. Some of the background I'll provide is the actual background of the organizing that took place around the Green New Deal prior to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez taking on that banner of that struggle, some of the history, some of the challenges, and some of how it was embedded in white supremacy and racism and other things that we have to deal with in our movements on a day-to-day basis. But before that, I should shortly say that my name is Ananda Litan, and like Melina said, I am the son of migrant parents from South Asia and East Asia, from the lands of the Khasi Hills, the Khasi tribes, and the Hunan Mountains. And I haven't fully explored all my ancestry yet, but the place where I identify that was home to where my great-grandparents came to was one of the first places in South Asia that I call an early experiment in decolonization. It was a community called Shantiniketan, where a poet who brought people together felt that we really needed to look to and delve into the roots of our identity if we really wanted to purge ourselves of British colonial rule. This was in the early 1900s, and so I'm a child of that movement, that social time, and so a lot of what I do reflect on has been passed on down to me by my forebearers, who really sought to align themselves with the earth and the earth's original instruction, and everything that you've outlined here about really looking to the original peoples of the land, wherever you are, the first inhabitants, the First Nations, the Indigenous peoples of the land. That is where I think we will find a lot of the solutions and strategies for the pathways we need to chart, as we tackle climate change and all these complex ecological crises, is in our own embedded ancestral knowledge. With that, one of the challenges our ancestors dealt with going back, almost 80 years ago now, during the time of the Great Depression, was a proposition that was seen by many, especially in progressive white society, as a progressive initiative called the New Deal during the time of the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which really invested billions of dollars at the time, hundreds of billions of dollars, in creating new infrastructure across the country, promising jobs at a time of economic depression, really addressing a lot of, and some people even felt, class struggle, like amongst a lot of working class Americans. However, they were working class white Americans, and we cut out Black, Brown, Indigenous peoples out of that program was exactly where the challenges that persisted beyond that time, where the original New Deal, by cutting out Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities in that time period, created concepts such as redlining, which was a term that was an official policy doctrine, if you will, to cut out people if they were not white from access to such jobs, from access to such new infrastructure. And that is a real part of the policy framework, the racialized policy framework that really gave birth to the environmental justice movement then in the 70s and 80s, which started challenging the notion that all these polluting industries were being sited in Indigenous communities, in African-American communities, in Latino and poor migrant communities around the country. And that more research showed that it was our communities that were disproportionately burdened by the pollution coming from those kind of that polluting infrastructure, if you will. And so redlining continued. The New Deal, which was seen as a progressive initiative that really attempted to address poverty through economic revitalization, actually turned out to be highly racist and problematic in the long run. And so when it reemerged in our conversations, fast forward 50 years, in the last 5 or 6 years, especially in the student divestment campaign that had been engaged by a lot of climate advocacy groups to really shift universities and institutions away from fossil fuel investments. It was between this new look at how do we look at addressing poverty and race, poverty, and climate change in the same strategy, and also Naomi Klein's book on systemic change that really inspired this new inquiry into looking at how does economic policy really serve ecological need, if you will. I'm maybe painting a grandiose picture. Those folks are strictly thinking about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. But in reality, I think the spirit of it is that economy should follow our knowledge of ecology, that our management of eco being home, the root of Greek roots of that word being home, should follow our knowledge and our study of home, ecology, the oikos logos, our knowledge and understanding of home. And it still remained, while this discussion was going on, it still remained perhaps discussion dominated by white NGOs, certainly by white NGOs, even though they're more progressive and aligned with us in many ways, these student divestment groups. But they left out all the concerns of Indigenous, Black and Brown communities, of environmental justice communities on the front lines. They felt they could move forward and save the world with this new notion that economic policies restructured to serve the environment could actually solve the problem, when they hadn't actually addressed the core ingredient, that you needed to have those people who are first and most impacted centered in that conversation, whose knowledge and connection to the land was key to guiding us through this puzzle. So the Green New Deal evolved with this discussion amongst mostly white NGOs, and as a result, it stayed in that sphere until some of our folks caught wind that, hey, there was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had been to Standing Rock, who was this amazing, beautiful voice. Her and the rest of the squad, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, there were these amazing, powerful, beautiful, bold voices that had been recruited by the progressive Dems, were advancing a great agenda, but it was still excluding our communities. So fortunately for us, Indigenous Environmental Network, Climate Justice Alliance, a lot of our allied sister alliances got together and confronted that, challenged that. We discovered very quickly that embedded in their policy proposal was a lot of false solutions, like carbon trading and market-based mechanisms, that they didn't even realize. They didn't even know what it was about. So their core goal of the Green New Deal was reducing or achieving net zero emissions. Unbeknownst to these young student activists who had adopted this goal, the funder who had given them that goal to pursue was highly mired in the politics of carbon trading and market-based mechanisms that were actually benefiting the corporate polluters, causing climate change more than anyone. So we had to have a lot of conversations, and it actually only was recently that in this new round of the reintroduction of the Green New Deal policy text by AOC and others in Congress that they finally took out the reference to net zero emissions and market-based mechanisms. It just goes to show how much we need to struggle in our movements. I'll wrap up by saying that it's movements require struggle. I've oftentimes advised my colleagues, my comrades, that we, just because the white NGOs still embody so much white supremacy behavior, problematic racialized behavior, doesn't mean that we can give them a wide berth. We can't afford to do that anymore. We need to take it to them, call them in, hold them accountable, call them out for their racist behavior, and then put the effort in to make them realize that they need to center the voices of Indigenous communities, the voices of frontline Black and Brown communities in this struggle, the voices of those historically most impacted, so that we can advance an agenda that really truly serves our needs and the needs of our common Mother Earth. On that final thing, I'd say there's Melina and I and many others took part in a publication called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, and I'll put it into the chat box here. We just came out with it. It really highlights a lot of the false solutions that NGOs can sometimes fall prey to if we don't have a critical lens, if we don't have a critical lens guided by our local place-based knowledge and our ancestral knowledge from our movements. And the piece that was, there's a solutions piece in that that's worth looking at, that says, okay, well, what does constitute the pathway to real solutions, and hope maybe that will be useful to this really critical construction of what a red deal needs to look like. Finally, parallel to this, if it hasn't been mentioned, our sisters and brothers with the Movement for Black Lives and comrades with the Movement for Black Lives have recently come up with the Red, Black, and Green New Deal platform. And it may be important to open up a dialogue there, because that is really centered in the Black liberation movement, which is critical and an intertwined struggle. And by calling it a Red, Black, and Green New Deal, I think they recognize that it needed to be rooted in Indigenous struggle of Turtle Island, but also in the struggle of, against anti-Black racism across the land. So, but thank you for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to learning from others and further discussion on this front.
Hi. Thank you, Ananda, for giving us that nice overview for us to kind of understand what we're delving into today and in the context of all of our works. And yeah, we'll have more questions and answers after Rebekah and Jen present. But I think Rebekah is going to go first. And as I mentioned, Rebekah is a Nihiao Eskew, like me, currently acting as a program coordinator at Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective and an independent researcher. So I'm just going to pass it over to you, Rebekah, to start. And then, hi, Jen, I see that you're here now, and I already introduced you to, and I'll introduce you again when you present after Rebekah. So I'll hand it over to Rebekah first. Hi.
Hi, Tansa. Thank you so much, Melina Gozani, for that introduction, and thank you, Ananda, for your presentation. I really appreciate the words that you had spoke there, especially on the explaining the Red Deal a little bit more in depth. So, Tansa, my name is Rebekah Sinclair. I am Osawe Maskwa Squayan at the Sianasun, Wichanida, Barren Lands First Nation, and Little Saskatchewan First Nation. My name is Rebekah. I am originally from Barren Lands First Nation. I'm Hannah and mother of 3 that are all homeschooling. So just an FYI, I like to put that right out there right away, is that I have 3 kids running around, all doing work silently, hopefully. So we'll see. I am joining you guys from Treaty 1 territory, as I'm a guest in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And then I guess I'll let Jen introduce herself, and then we can get started on the project that we've been both collaborating on. As Melina had said, I am an independent researcher that is working with Indigenous Climate Action on decolonizing climate policy, and that's how I've been invited here today. So I'll leave it to you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for being late. My name is Jen Gabi. I'm a settler, activist, and researcher based in Quebec in Abenaki territory, unceded Abenaki territory. And I came to be part of this project because a couple of years ago at a conference, Ariel and I met. I just found out I got 2 years of postdoctoral funding after I finished my PhD. And I said, is there any kind of research that would be useful that I could help with? And then this idea of doing a big critique of federal climate policy came up. And so I've been involved with this team, with a team at ICA, and with working with Rebekah on decolonizing climate policy in Canada. And so that's why I'm here today. It's an honor to be here.
I'm just going to share my screen so that we can see our slide presentation. You can all see it?
Alrighty, so the idea at the beginning of the project, so Rebekah and I are just going to pass it back and forth through the slides for a while. But yeah, like I said, I came to this project because Ariel had in her mind for a while this idea that federal climate policy was not only failing to actually inspire real climate action, but it was also seeming to exclude Indigenous people. And so again and again, Indigenous people have been asked to give their input, and the input did not seem to be making a difference to what was happening. And so we developed this project to have 2 phases, and we've completed phase 1, and we are now at the beginning, or like nicely into phase 2. So the first phase was to do a critical policy analysis of these two documents. The PanCanadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which came out in 2016, and then the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy Plan that came out in December of last year, which, so we call them the PCF and the HEHE. So those are our fun acronyms. And so this is the first phase is this critical analysis. So what we did was we created this research project where we, designed the research together. We developed an analysis framework, which maybe you can go to the next slide and I'll show you the analysis framework. So what we did was we created this giant spreadsheet, which in all the columns had all the pillars of all these policies. So, carbon pricing and, clean energy, all these different pillars of the plans and policies. And then in the columns, we had different affirmations of Indigenous rights, including Section 35, different parts of Section 35, different parts of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, including wording around free, prior, informed consent, etc. And we also in the column, not the columns, but in the rows, had many of the recommendations and the calls to action stemming from the many government inquiry reports, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, and the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So all these huge federal inquiries had led to many really, really, really important calls to action for, building better relationships between the, the colonial state and Indigenous people. And we wanted to see, are these climate policies and plans, all the pillars in them, actually respecting these calls to action, respecting these affirmations of Indigenous rights or not? So those were, can you go back 2 slides, Rebecca? Sorry. I just want to also share that we had other methods too, because we found that a lot of the things we wanted to find out was not actually available online or in these documents. Like, we couldn't figure out how were these plans actually made. So to find out some of that stuff, we actually conducted some interviews with some high-ranking policymakers in the federal government. Yeah, and then we drafted a report, and it was peer reviewed by a bunch of Indigenous experts as well as the ICA team, and then a report was released. Okay, now you can go back to the findings. So one aspect of our findings was that aside from the actual contents of the plan, the process by which these plans were developed and created were deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. So Indigenous people and their rights, their knowledge, and their climate leadership were mentioned again and again and again, like 168 times, I think we counted, in both plans, yet the Indigenous people were actually structurally excluded from the decision-making tables where the plans were made. So through that process leading up to the PanCanadian Framework, the NIOs, so the AFN and the MNC and the ITK had been, so all these national Indigenous organizations had been advocating that Indigenous people need to be at that table where these plans are created. But because representatives from 2 specific provinces, which you can try to guess, actively opposed Indigenous people being at the table, and they have veto power, the provinces have veto power, so Indigenous people were excluded from as decision makers, instead relegated to, people to be consulted. So instead, the working groups that were creating these documents, these plans, just instead of actually working with Indigenous people to co-create these plans, instead they consulted Indigenous people off on the side, just like they, consulted industry and academia and stuff. So this was, okay, so not only was this very, very bad process, next slide, please, Rebecca. Not only was this a bad process, but it actually constitutes the violation of Indigenous rights to self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent as defined by United Nations. So I'm going to just hand it over to Rebecca to unpack all this a bit.
Thanks, Jen. I think when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, it's really important to really address what all of these words really entail, like free, prior, before the project has started, and informed consent. Informed consent is the biggest one in my books, because often when we go into community and consult with community, we're ENGOs or government or proponents are bringing in a lot of their expert knowledge and their Western way of thinking, and don't incorporate Indigenous worldview or Indigenous world the way we have conversations, the way we have relationships and have a cup of tea and talk to each other. And my litmus test for informed is always like, is my grandma going to understand what I'm trying to say to her? Is my grandma the one that taught me everything that I know? Is she going to understand what I'm trying to do? So when I look at free, prior, and informed consent, I'm often thinking of this concept of, are we really providing informed consent to our nations? It conflicts with the Liberal government's commitment to reconciliation and nation-to-nation, Inuit to Crown, and government-to-government relationships. So this is a big one for me too, because when we talk about relationships in Indigenous community, we're talking about a respectful, mutual relationship, and this doesn't often transpire in terms of policy and climate, and even in the way that the HIHI and the PCF were created. This was not created under that commitment to reconciliation, which really means, like, are we respecting the Indigenous experts as they are? Quite often I see in documents that we've consulted these climate experts, and and then we've also consulted national Indigenous organizations, which is not to say that they shouldn't, but our people are experts, and there should be a space for that. We assert that Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge and generational knowledge is something that's going to save us and that are paramount to the climate justice movement, but we rarely see them as asserted as experts within those documents. It also ignores many of the calls to action emanating from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the RCAP, and the National Inquiry to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, which Jen went over in detail with the what did we call it? The something matrix. A lot more. Anyway, I was having a conversation with my kids who are teenagers, so they're 14 and 15, and with my grandma, and I was telling them about this matrix, and they were all like, "What are you trying to say to me?" So I was like, okay, we just did some cross-referencing is basically what I said. And I'm careful to note too that I'm not trying to use layman's terms, but I'm trying to be accessible to my grandma whose first language is not English, and many of our ways of knowing is very deeply embedded into that language, and how we interpret things in this world is embedded into that language. So when we're saying accessible language, we're saying that we're not talking to somebody that's first language is English, really. So sorry, I'm just trying to do this slowly. Jen usually handles the slides, so this is my first time just handling slides. But the contents are, I'll let Jen speak to the section of the PCF report though.
So yeah, so we definitely exposed that the process by which the plans were developed were deeply, deeply unjust and actually violate Indigenous rights and the many calls to action and commitments to nation relationships. Yes, but it's not just the process. Not surprisingly, the contents of the plans are also very, very problematic. One big thing is that both plans allow for the continuation of fossil fuel production, which we know is a primary source of greenhouse gas emissions and also a major contributor to the violation of Indigenous rights in Canada. So that's a deep problem. Rebecca can go to the next slide, and we'll. Do you want to talk about these, or do you want to talk?
Yeah, I'll talk about these.
Great.
I always think about like that GHG emission situation as the government saying you need to limit your use of single plastics and you need to drive less. Meanwhile, they're over here allowing the big polluters a pass. And that's something that we all, like as citizens, need to think about when we address climate issues, or when we look and critically evaluate climate issues. Is this a me thing, or is this a you thing? And yeah, so anyway, some of the climate solutions proposed ignore the realities faced by Indigenous communities and nations. I grew up in a small northern community in Manitoba, and there's a lot of these solutions that are proposed that are proposed for people that are able, that are that are urban and ignore the realities faced by Indigenous people, like public transportation. There's no public transportation up north. In fact, they took away, so I grew up in Lynn Lake, Manitoba. My primary school years were there. And it's the end of the road of Manitoba, as they say. And they took away the greyhound, or the gray, I think it was Grey Goose after a while, I don't know. But they took away the bus system there. So when people have to leave that town to go to medical appointments and those kinds of things, they're having to rethink that situation. So public transportation is one of the things that's just highlighted. And then electric vehicles in the north, even electric vehicles here in Winnipeg, like none of those things have been really highlighted. And that's not to say that these are not good solutions for urban dwellers, but they ignore the realities faced by Indigenous communities. The climate solutions proposed also lead to disproportionate negative impacts to Indigenous people and violations of Indigenous rights, like this carbon tax. Like I said, I grew up in a northern community, and carbon tax often relates to higher prices in food and relates to food insecurity in northern communities. Like these are not issues that are addressed at all. They talk about hydro being like the green solution in this, and I've seen firsthand the destruction that hydro has done to Indigenous communities without really repercussions of that. It fails to address the structural inequalities continually reproduced through ongoing colonial relationships and policies in Canada. Unique circumstances of Indigenous people, the vulnerable Indigenous people, without ever addressing that they're directly responsible for those unique circumstances that Indigenous communities find themselves in. It is pitting an us versus them mentality with the rest of so-called Canada. How we address the issues that are ongoing and that are systemic. We can't propose solutions or propose that you're helping Indigenous community without really addressing the fact that the reason we're in this situation is because you didn't listen to us in the first place. Okay, so I'll let Jen speak from here.
Oops. To be fair, the PanCanadian Framework and the HEHE are the strongest climate policies we've seen in Canada. And there are some signs that the HEHE is an improvement to the PCF. For example, the HEHE brings in wording around Indigenous rights to self-determination. The PanCanadian Framework never had wording around self-determination. I know that is the hard work of folks at the AFN and other national Indigenous organizations who've been fighting to get those kind of words put in. So we do not want to be overly critical. So we're being critical, but we want to acknowledge all that there's some good to these plans. But that said, they are so significantly flawed in their process and their content, and these flaws have huge implications for, yes, the ongoing relationships between Indigenous people and Canada. So there's huge implications for that. And there are also implications for these plans' ability to actually drive a just energy transition. So not only are they unjust and replicating colonial relations, but they're actually too weak to actually drive real climate action and a real just energy transition. So when we talk about just energy transition, we're talking about how do we transform our whole energy economy in a way that undoes systemic oppressions around race, class, sex, etc. Like, how do we undo these systemic oppressions, including ongoing colonial relations in Canada, while we transform our energy and energy economy? And these plans, yeah, they are not designed to do that. So that's a real problem. So then, yeah, holistic transformation. Thanks, Ananda. So there's huge implications for the flaws that we're naming. Next slide. Thanks, Rebekah. So we most of the report, there's a good 40 pages or something on what's wrong with the thing, but then we didn't want to leave it there. We also provided in the end of the report calls to action, like some ways forward, some ways for going forward where climate policy can be developed in ways that is not replicating these dynamics that we're seeing. So again, we offer this report not to negate the work that has been done to improve climate policy so far, especially by Indigenous folks, but as a call to action to organizers, researchers, and policymakers to do better and to engage in the following. So bear with this here as we go through some of the key points for moving forward with climate policy in Canada. We need to acknowledge that the exclusion of Indigenous climate leadership and the denial of Indigenous rights to self-determination isn't just unjust, it actually forecloses on some of the most powerful forces for transformative systemic change in Canada. And I believe that's actually why Indigenous people were excluded from the table. And Alberta and Saskatchewan know that. Bring Indigenous people to the table with their rights to self-determination, and all of a sudden, fossil fuel industry is in trouble. And that's, anyways, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent there, but I believe that that is, okay. Okay, second, recognize that climate policy can be made more just and more effective through meaningful and full inclusion of Indigenous peoples and the upholding of their rights, knowledges, and sovereignty. We want people to engage in ways that address the climate crisis by requiring transformation and undoing of colonial relations and structures in the work everyone's doing. So when we've been speaking to settler audiences, we're really emphasizing asking people to really include undoing colonial relations as part of their climate work. We want people to be to be engaging in meaningfully co-creating climate policy in ways that are rooted in Indigenous self-determination, and acknowledging that this is going to require deep and broad relinquishing of power from settler colonial structures and systems and people to address both the climate and the inequality crises in Canada. And next slide. Sorry, one back. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So given all these things that the PCF and the HEHE did wrong, we've laid out 10 things that climate policy needs to do going forward in order to not do these same flaws again and again. So one, need to include Indigenous communities and nations as full partners at policy-making decision tables. And national Indigenous organizations like the NIO, those are fine, but those are advocates for communities. They should not be treated as decision makers. You need to actually engage directly with Indigenous nations and communities. We need climate policy in Canada that raises up the leadership of Indigenous women and two-spirit LGBTQIA+ folks. Policy that respects Indigenous rights to self-determination and free prior informed consent in the processes of developing the policy and in the kind of solutions that are put forward. 4, policy that adheres to federal commitments to nation Inuit Crown and government to government relationships. 5, policy that upholds the calls to action, all the calls to action emanating from the TRC, the Royal Canadian Commission, and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Next slide. We need climate policy that promotes climate solutions that take into account the realities faced by Indigenous communities and nations in both rural and urban situations, like Rebekah was talking about, not just climate policy for urban settlers. That's not climate policy. So we need climate policy that does not disproportionately impact Indigenous people negatively, like carbon pricing does, like hydro does, like natural gas does. No. And we need policy that acknowledges and actively addresses structural inequalities that are continually being reproduced through colonial relations, processes, and structured in this so-called Canadian context. And the last 2 points are that we need policy that addresses the root causes of climate change. Colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, etc. And finally, that engages with intersectional understanding of climate to design intersectional climate solutions that reduce emissions while undoing systemic oppression. So by intersectional, we mean like we want climate policy that actually understands how climate and the climate crisis is being disproportionately impacting women, racialized people, poor people, etc., and actually understand those connections, those intersections, and develop policies that can actually address those. So these are our 10 calls to actions, and those are the 10 things that are guiding us as we move into phase 2, which Rebekah will tell us all about. Yeah, so just this slide is just to share that we released a report, I guess about over a month now, maybe even 6 weeks ago, in English and a summary in French as well. And then since then, we've been launching into phase 2, where we're engaging with those 10 principles for going forward.
Thanks, Jen. So the phase 2 of Decolonizing Climate Policy was to bring together an advisory council of Indigenous-led climate policy ideas from Indigenous folks. These are our people on our climate policy out on the land. I think it's really important to center ourselves in what we're doing and why we're doing the things that we're doing is actually for our relatives, the land and the water. So we had come up with some questions when I have started to think about what Indigenous-led climate policy would look like how do we honor the land and water and our relatives? And how do we find 5 people to represent the vast differences of Indigenous folks from across so-called Canada? This is a big one for me because quite often we see this replicated in different kinds of programs with proponents, with climate or policy or that sort of thing. And we want to represent all the people. Like, we want to check these boxes off. We want to have a youth, we want to have an elder, we want to have LGBTQ representation, we want to make sure that we're representing the North and the South and the East and the West. And a lot of these questions came up because another glaring issue is that we're not homogenous. We're not treated as if we all our own have sovereignty within ourselves, but also within our culture. There are many different types of Cree people, as many of you probably already know. And I think that we need to start to pay homage to that idea of how we protect and defend the land, and that those generational knowledges comes through each one of these regions. So we had thought, how nicely fitting is that the so-called Canada is separated into 5 distinct biomes. We did a call out to each of these biomes to have representatives sit on the panel that would really honor the land that they're on and have the generational knowledge from those biomes to help in climate justice and in climate policy. We also started to think about how do we create policy that aligns with Indigenous worldview and honors Indigenous rights. This word decolonizing, I recently had a conversation with an Indigenous youth and Métis youth that was talking a lot about when we say the words like reconciliation, they start to lose their meaning or become buzzwords. And what does that really mean for how we move forward in Indigenous worldview, and how do we find ourselves in those places? And that really starts with decolonizing ourselves, and myself included. I think that we, like, for myself, I've often come up into this world where it's very colonial context, where we talk about how we're going to go to university and we're going to be these people, and we're going to have these careers and we're going to say these things, but without our culture, without our language, without our land, we're just perpetuating that assimilation, which I've heard many graduates have said themselves. So we developed the Indigenous-led climate policy with some really amazing folks across so-called Canada. We have Tiffany Travers, who is in the mountain forest biome. Swiftcummick territory, I believe is how you say it. Full bios on our Indigenous-led climate policy advisory council is on the Indigenous Climate Action website. We have Deborah McGregor in the temperate deciduous forests, who I just fangirl over all of the work that she has done. And so I'm very happy that we have her on as well. We have Jesse Mike from the tundra, grandmother Catherine White Cloud from the boreal forests, and Brianna Brown as our youth representative, and Pamela Beebly in grasslands biome. So I don't know if you noticed, but then there's 6, not 5. Part of that conversation was that we really do need to have that youth representation and hold a space for that youth person. So ICA had the team had said, let's make a youth position, and Brianna Brown is our youth representative in that respect. So moving forward in phase 2, we're in the thick of it as as I would say. So I'm looking forward to really, we had some timelines, and Jen and I were talking about that this afternoon. We had some timelines, and we were going to release this report, and we were going to do these things. And oftentimes when I'm on the res, or when I'm talking with my grandma or elders or knowledge keepers, a lot of the times they're like, "Can you slow down?" Well, it'll happen when it happens. And I'm often reminded of that, like when it happens is when that process comes out to light in a good way, and that's part of decolonizing how we do these things. So I that's kind of where we're at now, and coming forth, I want to do a kind of a call to action to all of our Indigenous listeners that want to be a part of this project, or have a voice in this project, because I think that part is important. The more we can get through across so-called Canada in that respect is very important. While we have these representatives in these biomes, it's still important to hear from all of our Indigenous folks across so-called Canada. We're launching a survey under the guidance of the Advisory Council. We hope to have a knowledge exchange in the future, and there's a few other wonderful ideas that are coming forth where we can engage Indigenous folks across the nation, and hope to get your input on that. Part of this idea of climate policy and climate justice in the second phase is unpacking what that means. What does policy mean in an Indigenous world context, and what does protocol mean, and how do we have for accountability and regulation? So we're really trying to unpack all of these words that are colonially used to confuse us, and have our native language speakers confused in how they participate in this conversation. So I hope to hear a lot more from in my inbox and virtually from everybody across the land, so that we can make this as robust as possible. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Rebekah and Jen, for presenting on decolonizing climate policy. So needs to happen across Turtle Island, across the world. A lot of what you talk about resonates with my experience of trying to participate at these tables and just getting frustrated, sad, unseen, excluded. Yeah, all of the things that you talked about. I think for Indigenous organizers trying to be a part of colonial processes, it's very challenging, a lot of emotional labor, a lot of educating our non-Indigenous academics and folks that want to do climate policy but don't really understand the full history of, the inheritance of colonization across Turtle Island. And so it's a challenge, and I feel like a lot of times we're speaking different languages. And I agree, like with what you said around with your kokum, like with my auntie who is, a Cree, like her first language. All my aunts, uncles, and dad are like all their first language is Cree, and so like having different discussions even around the world climate change. When we were translating climate change into Cree for this TV show that I was shooting, Power to the People, like she was like, I had to explain to her what climate change was in English, and then she would translate it into Cree, and she was like, oh, that's respecting Mother Earth, and it's just like this different way of seeing climate change. A word is so far away, so far removed, as if it's something that's not a part of us, whereas in the Cree context, in a Cree worldview, in a Cree translation is like that protecting, respecting, having relationship with the natural world around us. And I think that was just so like eye-opening to me, of just even those simple things of, as if our communities don't understand what climate change is, or don't understand, all of these difficult, challenging scientific terms, which are meant to separate us, which are meant to keep us up, not a part of the dialogue and discussion. And we need to have all people included in it. So I think it's so great when we start picking apart climate policy and showing how it's making people feel separate from the solutions. And that's not going to do in a climate crisis, because we need everyone to be involved in these issues. And a lot of times colonial language separates us from the task at hand, which is so a lot of times so simple. You just go back to our traditional values. We've always been net zero, quote unquote, communities, and now this term is being co-opted for something else that is detrimental to our communities. And I also see a question here. I wanted to ask all three of you about, could you speak more to nature-based solutions and this thing of like net zero and nature-based solutions that has this term that has become more increasingly popular, and how that goes about violating Indigenous rights. And so I'll pass it over to Ananda first, and then Rebekah and Jen, if you guys are okay with jumping in, and all three of you can answer this question if you're comfortable with it. We can start off a Q&A discussion part of this conversation, if that's all right with y'all. Thank you.
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to really thank Rebekah and Jen. That was a really illuminating, beautiful presentation you made, powerful, and you hit all the key points. It's open doors to so many conversations. I don't think we have time for all of them, but some of the things that highlighted for me were all the false solutions you listed that Indigenous communities are currently faced with, because the corporations are leveraging these climate policies. Like we should be very wary, because as corporate polluters are leveraging all these national climate policy frameworks to actually get to Indigenous lands, to get to Indigenous resources, and continue this agenda of theft and dispossession and displacement and extraction. There's whether it's nature-based solutions, whether it's carbon pricing frameworks, whether it's LNG, bridge fuels, alternatives to fossil fuels, bioenergy. These are all a suite of colonial extractive projects that will continue the settler colonial agenda, across these lands. And so it's important for people to inform themselves and really get whatever popular education we can out there. I really appreciate what you said about decolonizing our movements first, ourselves first, because really our instruction is really about how do we shift not only the voices, the leadership voices, but in even the ways we do things. And that requires decolonizing, basically purging ourselves of dominant European cultural constructs and frameworks, like purging ourselves of the white supremacist culture, issues that we're starting to do in this era of anti-racism work and calling out racist constructs. But I think we need to go even deeper. And really there's this process. I'm actually working with some other folks on this call with communities, Indigenous communities fighting mining, to look at how do we actually look at decolonizing our practice and really shifting to place-based, knowledge sharing, learning, and like you said, making our grandmothers' voices really lead, kind of be the cardinal, guideposts for, how we, work through this complex puzzle. So I won't belabor more other than saying that, like Melina said, they're co-opting our language constantly, whether it's climate justice, whether it's nature-based solutions, even Indigenous ecological knowledge is really threatened constantly by various research, fully funded research faculties and institutions who want to get in there and make money off traditional ecological knowledge across the land base. So really being conscious of that, but also then not being afraid to kind of pivot and challenge the colonial constructs whenever we sense that there's something afoot or wrong with them. Check. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Ananda. Really appreciate that. I think when we talk about nature-based solutions, I think it's really important to look at this, any kind of greenwashing terms in a critical lens. What does that really mean, and who we're co-opting, again, things that our communities are already doing, have already been doing. And we see that champion through Indigenous women. And we're taking that hard-earned labor that they've already done, that inherent responsibility. And I wanted to make mention too about how my grandma, my gugum, always talks about I'm just going to the bush. I'm just doing this thing, and this is what I'm doing. And it's very simplified for her in the sense that it's such an inherent responsibility. It's so embedded in the fabric of our being that we don't even want to label it as a grandiose thing, right? And I think that that's where we need to really be wary as citizens, as Indigenous people, when we see contexts like nature-based solutions and green energy and that sort of thing. So I always revert back to our issues with the treaties and that misunderstanding of what the treaty means and that sort of thing. So I feel like with climate policy, with new terms coming up in policy, we really need to look at that with a critical lens. And it's not to say that like in our worldview, in our natural law, reciprocity needs to be the very forefront of how we're doing anything in this context. So when we look at nature-based solutions, it's not to say that Indigenous people can't be a part of that conversation, but more of a part of that conversation and how reciprocity is the forefront of our natural law, and that needs to be the most paramount. But I'll leave it there and just be critical and wary of all of these new terms that are coming up. I always constantly say this too, about like the straw situation. Oh, it just drives me bananas when people are like, I don't use plastic straws. I'm like, that's great, but what else are you doing? That's kind of where I sit with that. So I tend to do a lot of storytelling when I do my explanation or whatever, and that is also an Indigenous concept or worldview and how we relate to the world. So that was on it.
Shall I build on that? Can I build on that? Yeah.
Yes,
So I've been thinking a lot about nature-based solutions ever since. Okay, so the HEHE came out in December. And one of the big differences between the PCF and the HEHE, they're both shitty in a lot of similar ways, but HEHE was shitty in its own special way by having a huge emphasis on nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are all the rage right now in federal climate policy in Canada and elsewhere, I think. And it's really, really alarming. And it's alarming because they're putting all this emphasis, and I think there's something like, the HEHE said they're going to spend something like $3 billion on nature-based solutions. And so nature-based solutions, as they define them, are carbon offsets that support the planting of trees, the restoration of wetlands, and sequestration of carbon in agricultural soils. Okay, so that all sounds fine and everything, except, those sound like good things to do, right? Except that they're completely strategically using nature-based solutions, sequestering carbon over here so that they can keep extracting and burning fossil fuels over here. So they're completely using it, and like it's just greenwashing of offsets. It's like offsets got a bad name because Indigenous people have been organizing for years and years about the deep problems with carbon offsets and other capitalist market-based solutions to climate change. And this is something I learned a lot from Ariel, is this due to this resistance and to this organizing against carbon offsets, the policymakers are like, oh, I think offsets are wrong. I think they're getting a bad rep. Let's call them nature-based solutions. Indigenous people like that, right? I'm pretty sure that's what's going on, and it's super dark because just like any other offsets, nature-based solutions is going to create new round of like financial interests or not corporate, but like capital interest in Indigenous territories. New people thinking about ways they can make money off of Indigenous territories with huge risks for more and more land grabs in 2021. So this is what's going on. This is how dark climate policy is, and it's how misguided it is and how potentially disastrous it is around Indigenous rights and Indigenous people's realities. So this is something we need to be really alerted to and really hold the government accountable, and as well hold NGOs accountable who are promoting nature-based solutions. And I just want to say that I'm right now been involved with a bunch of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and organizers and communities across the country, and we just today submitted a application for $6 million from the federal government to do Indigenous-led nature-based solutions. So we're trying to do a crazy Jedi move of getting a bunch of federal money to get in front of this giant problem, to reframe what nature-based solutions from an Indigenous perspective with Indigenous rights and title at the heart of what's nature-based solutions. So if, just like Rebekah said, if anyone wants to get involved with our Decolonizing Climate project, contact Rebekah, put our emails in the in the chat. And if anyone wants to get involved with Indigenous-led nature-based solutions, if we get the $6 million, including projects on the ground, getting them funded that people are already doing and just not calling nature-based solutions. So yeah, get in touch with me about that. I'll let you know if we get the money. Okay, thanks for letting me.
Can I add a thought to that? That was that was excellent. And I just want to say, just listening to you, it made me think there's a couple of things that are happening with the dominant culture, with corporate world and corporate NGO world. Diversity, equity, inclusion programs have become like this token checklist, a token. And I usually say they will, if we're not wary, we're cautious, they will serve to reinforce the status quo, the extractivist status quo. So how do we shift that to something, unless diversity, equity, inclusion are rooted in justice, in a framework of justice, ecology, decolonization, and intersectionality, all things that I saw in your presentation, that we don't actually prevent the status quo from being carried on. So one of the things that you said made sense to me, a critical lens we need to apply here is where they expropriate Indigenous concepts and try to monetize and commodify them. And a perfect example is biochar, or the use of fire, because there's this huge debate right now because they're promoting biochar as an agricultural product, which makes sense at a certain very micro place-based level, but not where they're converting massive forests and displacing Indigenous peoples in sub-Saharan Africa to create biochar farms. So it's where they take an important tool that is relevant to place and then exploit it and try to make it a one-size-fits-all silver bullet, is where it goes wrong. And I think one of the things that we can do is to really remind them that real climate justice solutions can never be one-size-fits-all. You cannot have a national framework that works everywhere. The local leadership always has to provide leadership, because that's where the knowledge base is most relevant. So I'll leave it at that. But I'd love to hear more as your work on decolonizing climate policy advances, and I'm so grateful that you're doing that.
I just want to make a quick mention to what Jen had said. I don't know if you guys had caught on to it, but it's really like flipping the script here. What more do you need from Indigenous people? Not what are we taking? How much more money do we need as Indigenous people? But like, what more do you need from us? You've literally stripped us of everything, and you still require more. And I think that is an important contest, especially the discourse that's going on right now is how much more money are the Indigenous people going to need? No, how much more do you need from us? Because we've been giving and giving and giving, and not getting any reciprocity back in return, or a meaningful relationship in that sense. So I want to, I noticed that in Jen's talk, is that real flipping of the script there.
I agree. I mean, I think that's kind of what politicized me as a young person, coming from a community that has resource extraction all around it. Tar sands, logging, oil, gas, fracking, conventional oil, like that's what I grew up around. And, it got to the point where Amnesty International did a study in 2008, that there at that point had been $14 billion taken out of our traditional territory. And at the time, my family still went without running water. I grew up going to outhouses, and that was the reality. There was no running water, like as a child taking baths in these little tin baths that you have to warm up the water manually. Like that's the reality of Indigenous communities. And it's like, how much more needs to be taken out of our homelands and somehow then trickled back into our communities, and that somehow that's the welfare dependency state. And I think people just need to understand that it is flipping the script, and it's the reversal of seeing, and then now it's Indigenous knowledge being utilized and commodified, and that's not okay. That's not appropriate. And we can't use market-based mechanisms and capitalism to fix the problem that caused the problem. And so I think this is the problem come with these conversations a lot of times that people don't realize in their colonial mentalities that they're not going to save themselves from themselves. And so I think, Ananda, too, you mentioned hoodwinked in the hothouse. So I don't know if you put the link in the chat, but that would be another great resource for folks to also understand what we're talking about with nature-based solutions and carbon offsets and net zero emission reductions. So this, Hoodwink has 3 iterations. We used to take them around Hoodwink in the hot house and like UNFCCC and like red offsets and like in 2010 and like give them out to people. And so that's how there was a lot of awareness raising around how offsets were so damaging to Indigenous communities. And now there's new words being developed. And so, yeah, really educate yourself, understand that a lot of these great sounding ideas and terms a lot of times sound really great, but they do have an insidious underbelly based in these market-based mechanisms that are very problematic. And now even solar geoengineering is something that is on the table, which is incredibly scary. If anybody's seen Snowpiercer, you'll know why. Just joking. But yeah, so we are coming up. So we have about 9 minutes left, and I wanted to go back to the Q&A. The first question that was asked is, I don't know if this is a quick yes and no answer, but have you seen any Indigenous knowledge or worldviews integrated into climate action strategies that actually have been helpful, or is just the knowledge being commodified for an ulterior purpose? And that's asked by the first Q&A. I don't know if you can see it in there. I'll also put it into the chat so you can see the question, but I just thought, that might be something interesting where we can, is there any examples or is there no examples? And that's why we have to create reports about how there's no examples. And so I don't know if you've seen anything local, Rebekah or Ananda or Den, or is there just like, we're all starting from scratch and this is day one, get go from here on out?
I think I'd like to respond. I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like it's a little bit of starting from scratch, and there's also some really good organizations that are leading this charge. They're working with Indigenous knowledge keepers and making sure that it's Indigenous led. So Pimichinaki here in Manitoba is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been worked on in the east side of Lake Winnipeg. If you want to look more into that, there's a website for that as well. But I think that when I was interviewing one of the knowledge keepers or elders on that project, she spoke very highly of how that work had come together and how there was meaningful collaboration, and her voice was heard. And yeah, I think that's part of how we start to look at climate action strategies and in protecting the spaces that we utilize and making sure that reciprocity is the forefront and natural law is the forefront, and that our Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers are the ones that are leading that conversation.
Nanda or Jen, do you want to mention anything that you might have seen locally? I have a couple that I can mention, but I wanted to see if you had seen anything that people could use as potential like models as we kind of decolonize climate policy work or climate strategies.
I don't know of any concrete examples in climate policy. I think there's this opportunity now as more and more climate policy spaces open up to recognize that, we need to actually look to people who know about these things a bit better than us. But it's starting to happen in one progressive section, I guess, of where progressive academia is involved in some of these spaces. One place where I think I've been following the work and supporting the work of the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Working Group over the last year, and they've really, I'm just blown away and amazed by some of the deep thinking, decolonization they've done of food sovereignty frameworks, and where they're having where Dawn and others in that world are having creating space amongst allies in food justice activists and sustainable agriculture academia. The principle of reciprocity is starting to kind of come into discussing how people rethink even what food land look like from an Indigenous perspective. So I think it's critical work. I think it's groundbreaking work, but I'd encourage wherever, I'd love to see more of that.
I just realized Tiffany Traverse is on our Indigenous-led Climate Policy Advisory Council from Secwepemc Territory is here. I just noticed that. And I know Tiffany's involved with incredible seed saving work and food sovereignty work in her territory. And I just want to raise that up And also in, yeah, hi, Tiffany. And also in Tiffany's territory is the tiny house of warriors. And I just feel like the question was about how Indigenous knowledge influencing climate action. And I don't know about climate policy, but climate action, like Indigenous knowledge and worldviews are leading climate action in Canada around land defense, around protecting water, around actually taking care, around, you know, disrupting colonial narratives that humans are somehow separate and dominant to nature. Like, so I see Indigenous worldviews and knowledge as completely leading climate action in Canada right now, and teaching settlers like myself how it's done, and how to unlearn our colonial misunderstandings that hold us back from real climate solutions. So I don't know about policy, but climate action all over the place.
Well, that's the thing about written and unwritten and oral tradition versus it's being seen as something set in stone and something like, oh, if it's written down, then therefore it's a real thing. And I think that's the most frustrating part of like coming from an oral tradition. It's everything needs to be written down for it to be verified. And it's just like, as opposed to what you were just saying, Jen, where Indigenous communities are using the knowledge that we have that's been passed down from generation to generation as stewards of this land for millennia. And, you know, that's how it's being enacted on the land. And we might not have it written down, but does that make a policy or does that, you know, it's still a strategy, like you said. So yeah, I agree. And then there's two communities that I have visited. One that I worked in solidarity with around the TMX pipeline with Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and they used Indigenous knowledge, their knowledge, in fighting the TMX pipeline. And there's a great report that they have online through Sacred Trust. And then also when I visited Kanaka Bar, they're using Indigenous knowledge and doing climate adaptation strategies in their nation, and like water sampling and all of these things. And I think there's so many local based solutions and local strategies that are happening and policies that are being implemented in Indigenous nations. It's just that sometimes we don't have as much accessibility to them because they're not as visible, or, you know, and so that's why we featured on Power to the People. But I just feel like a lot of these stories like need to be uplifted. Indigenous media needs to be uplifted. Indigenous stories need to be uplifted so that we know all of these amazing things that are happening across Turtle Island. And so we have 3 minutes left for the rest of this panel, but I wanted to ask this last question of, what are your thoughts on how to increase accessibility when it comes to engaging with climate policy? It seems like there is often exclusionary language used in the worldview of policy and environment, particularly engaging Indigenous and other communities of color, other BIPOC communities. And that's just in the last Q&A if y'all want to look at it. I don't know who wants to start first, but that's a good question to end our conversation today. So thank you.
I really actually wanted to answer this question. I saw this and I was like, I hope this is the question she asks next. Increasing accessibility means you're keeping it simple. So many times I've heard that from elders say, keep it simple. And that's to like look at the intersectionality of education. This concept of not intersectionality, but just cross-reference how education has been afforded to our Indigenous people, and that is where they're at. So meet people where they're at, and land-based. If you want to understand and engage in Indigenous community, meet them where they're at. Go onto the land, learn what those languages are, and adapt your conversation to that. And I think that that's one way, because I'm constantly trying to be accessible to my grandma by rewording everything I'm saying, calling her and asking her. And if you want to talk to my grandma, she'll probably say no. but you could talk to organizations like ICA and myself and Jen, and the work that we're doing here, and how to better engage Indigenous folks. So.
I totally agree with that. And a term that both of you used was flipping the script. I'd say for radical inclusion, we need to flip the script. And sometimes we need to hold ourselves accountable, especially some of our national organizations, and say, hey, staff need to move aside and make room for community leaders and community members and elders to step in, because we can easily become that checklist cadre unless we're wary of ensuring our community leader voice is heard. Check.
I just want to say that what we're talking about earlier about Indigenous worldviews and climate solutions and stuff, this is one thing we want to document in our project. So if you know of any, what we're talking about, Indigenous-led climate solutions, do get in touch with us and let us know, because we want to document and share these and raise these up. So please get in touch, and as well as if you want to fill out our surveys and do interviews and help create Indigenous-led climate policy in Canada, please get in touch.
Yeah, and there is, through Indigenous Clean Energy Social Enterprise, they did a study and research around that. There's actually 2,500 Indigenous-led climate solutions, from food security and renewable energy, all of the things across Turtle Island, across the north of the Medicine Line, and that there's these amazing projects that are happening across the board. So there's so many examples to draw upon, and that's what we decided to do actually in our Just Transition guide for ICA, is to develop a guide that talks about different types of technologies, food security, and also keeping it simple. And that's the point, is I feel like when I started implementing renewable energy, there was nowhere I could find it was like kind of just like all of this like research and documentation, but there was like no implementation strategies anywhere I could find. So I feel like trying to keep it simple and accessible to communities is so much more helpful, because then we'll see more climate solutions across the board, as opposed to just more and more documents that go over the heads of communities which are not accessible. So thank you so much for making this panel accessible, and thank you for making climate policy more accessible and breaking down the history in Ananda for us and the current present reality, and Jen and Rebekah for helping decolonize climate policy. It's so important in this work. So thank you so much, all three of you, for your amazing work and dedication to the survival of our planet and our people and all living beings. And I think Lindsay Montour, our program director, is going to come on and close us off and explain what's happening for the afternoon. So I just wanted to extend my gratitude to all three of you, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this conversation. And there was a request just for Rebekah, Nanda, and Jen, if you can stay on for a few minutes and just type any of if you want to type, for folks that maybe have like audio issues for what we're saying, if you can type anything here in the panelists and attendees section, like as typing, that would be great. If you can stay on. If you can't, that's okay. And if you're busy and booked, no worries. But that was a request that did come through in the chat function. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
I believe I'll to be joined by Ariel. I don't know if Ariel's joining.
I'm here. I'm here. Hi, everyone. All right, that was an amazing panel and presentation, and it has been an incredible day. For those that are just catching this day, it started with a nice opening prayer from Elder Skip, followed by a wonderful and amazing keynote presentation by Terry Lynn, and I've already forgotten her last name because I just refer to her as Terry Lynn the whole time. Terry Lynn, what is her last name, Lindsay?
Brandt.
Terry Lynn Brandt, who brought us into this really, really beautiful framing of what Indigenous ecologic economics are. And it was such a really wonderful way to start our day. And then we went into a really wonderful Just Transition panel that really walked us through, like, what does just transition look like when we're talking about new economies and energy systems and structures. That was done by the ICA staff with Melina, Jacob, and JC with the ICA team, that really talked about the programs and the ways in which we can see our whole communities can revive and restore what it means to be building economies from an Indigenous values perspective. And that took us into our nice break for the afternoon and into this really, really wonderful Red Deal panel. And it was such a great panel to really think about, like, what does it mean for us to be looking at what these structures are, that to create climate policies and these new economic paradigms to bring us into a climate stable future, how we can't do that without really acknowledging and reconciling the injustices that have happened, not just to the land, but also to the Indigenous peoples who hold deep relationships with these places. So it's just been such a powerful day full of amazing discussions. And I just thank all the participants for really participating in the Q&A, as well as some of the jam boards and the Miro boards, and the ways that we have made spaces for engagement. And I'm just so overwhelmed by all of the support and all of the great questions that everyone's brought forward. So Musi Cho for everyone. And Lindsay's going to give us a little bit into what's happening next.
Yes, before I start, I was going to close off with a Thanksgiving address in Gunit in the Mohawk language. We usually start this, or we usually say this before events, but we had our elder Skip start the day off, but I still think it's a good way to kind of bring our minds together and give thanks for everything that Creator has put here on the earth to sustain us. And it's just really nice to hear any chance you get, so I want to share. And then I'll go into where we're going next. So Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado neon Guesua, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Atini Staha Awaja, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Gatni Gordonia G Wandade, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Gunjuk Suan Gunjinagare ne Awange, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado neon Ohunde Suan, Dahna nene Aquat Gundigowana ne Jun Hekwa, nene Onaste o Sahera, Dahna ona Unsera, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Anungwasua, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Gahik Suan, Dahna nene Aquat Gundigowana ne Neo Hundessa, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Ojit Noa Sua, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Gariota Sua, Dahna nene Aquat Gundigowana ne Osconundo, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Garunda Agua, Dahna nene Aquat Gundigowana ne Obata, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Ojita Agua, Dahna nene Aquat Gundigowana ne Adunyu Goa, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Gayeri Nigawarage, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Yunkiso Taguan Badiweras, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano Dan Chidawat Nuwarado ne Achidawat G Agarakwa, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Yatisota Garakwa, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. A Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano de Atin Horado ne Yochisto Korun Yachitkarun Hiade, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. Dahno a Gwegon Scott ne G and did a walk with Nuni neon Guatni Gorna, Dano Dan Chidawat Nuwarado ne Sangwayat Diso, Atonian Duhak neon Guatni Gorna. Atonun Datkatari wat Gweni Gina Hoda Gari Wandakwa, the Gantano, and get Nigorha Wada Easy Iza Watkaway Neganu Hora Dunsera. Ato Nigawanage Donito. So just a reminder to all of you guys who registered for the working groups to refer to your email marked Working Groups Indigenous Economics Conference for the Zoom links. The working groups for the Red Deal and a Just Transition will begin just about 5 minutes. So 1:15 Pacific Standard Time, and then you adjust your time zones accordingly. But please feel free to drop in whenever you can. And Yawa, once again, for all of you guys who joined us today, and we hope to see you again in the working group. So, Yawa.
Yeah, and we'll see everyone also for tomorrow's sessions. We'll start at the same time, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And we are sharing this stuff live streamed on our YouTube channel. So if for folks that you might want to share this with, let us know and we can help share the link. Thanks, Lindsay, for the closing prayer. It was really beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.